Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program here at Wilson. We are delighted to be hosting this book talk with author Leslie Chang, and the book's title is Egyptian Made, Women, Work, and the Promise of Liberation. This is a very important book and topic, particularly for the Middle East program at the Wilson Center, because under the Middle East Women's Initiative at MEP, we have dedicated a lot of our research and analysis and reports to better understand the women and work formula in the Middle East and North Africa region. Is it about education? Is it about other barriers? And so this is very timely. Leslie also basically tells the story of women in work in Egypt through stories of Egyptian women. And so we truly look forward to this book talk, and thank you so much for coming to the Wilson Center for this discussion. I'm also delighted to introduce Lubna Hanna, who is going to be a discussant on the book, and she's a professor at California University at the Washington, D.C. Center. And with your experience and expertise, particularly on this topic, we look forward to your interventions and comments. And I'm delighted to be passing on the mic to my colleague Faria Nasruddin, who is our program associate and is leading all of our gender and women's rights work at MEP. So Faria, over to you.
Thank you, Marissa, and thank you for today's both in-person and online audience. Thank you to Leslie for this book and to Lubna for serving as today's discussant. To open the floor, I'll first turn to Leslie to give us an overview of the book, how she came to write about this topic, and the scope of everything in Egyptian Made. Leslie?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story. So I was working at the Wall Street Journal in China from the late 90s and the early 2000s. And, China was developing so quickly that it's very hard to sort of get a sense of the scope of the change in individual lives. And I noticed that a lot of the stories that were being written, especially about migrant workers, people moving to the city to work, were in a very negative light, sort of focusing on the worst abuses, people who were injured in the factories, maybe even died, had horrible experiences. And while there's certainly space for abuses to be reported on so that things can hopefully get better, I was curious about what migration and work would be like for an ordinary person, a young woman coming from rural China, usually in her teens. What kind of experience did she have? And so I just went down to this huge city in southern China called Dongguan, which is sort of the center of labor-intensive, low-skilled manufacturing. And I just talked to young women I met on the streets and asked them about their experiences. And then over a couple of years, I found two women who I followed over those 2 years. And what I found was that, amazingly, they completely could change their identities and their social status and their futures just through this work that we see as very punishing and borderline abusive. They saw as, this is better than being in the village where nobody listens to me, where I can't make much money, and where I don't, my parents are going to choose somebody that they want me to marry, and then I'm going to go and have the same life that my parents did. So I found it fascinating that there was this empowerment and this liberation that actually came from factory work, which we as outsiders see as kind of a very oppressive kind of experience. And so after we lived in China, my husband is also a writer. We lived in China for more than 10 years. We came back to the States, and we were like, well, we're still young. We want to go to some place that's totally different, learn a new language, stop being experts and just be completely ignorant and learn everything from the ground up all over again. So we chose the Middle East, and we decided to live in Egypt, which at the time when we were deciding around 2010, it was really quiet, and everyone was like, oh, nothing's going to happen. You're going to be bored. And of course, everything happened, and we were not bored, but we still decided to go at the end of 2011, and we spent 5 years there. And so I was still always interested in this idea of women, and of course, wherever you go and you say you're going to the Middle East, people say, well, what about the women? So it took me a while to find how should I report this story, who should I talk to, and eventually I came around again to the idea of women and work. Of course, the context is really different because in China, close to 60-something% of adult women are working. And in Egypt, I learned this number is very low, 20% or less. And so I was curious, who are the women who actually do work? They're definitely in the minority, but what drives them to work? How do they find the experience? And what does it bring them? And in the back of my mind, I was thinking it must bring them the same things that it brings people in China. How can it not bring empowerment and both economic and social and personal? So I started reporting in several factories in Egypt, and over a couple of years, I found really different things from what I found in China in ways that I thought were really interesting and important.
And moving more directly to the book, it follows three women mainly, Riham, Rania, and Dua, who have very different stories and multiple identities. How did you ultimately come to decide on this format and style of book to tell this story, both of their lives and also of the broader story of the Egyptian context that you comment on?
Yeah, I was really curious about the textile and garment industry because I know that employs women in large numbers. And of course, everyone knows about Egyptian cotton, and I was also really curious about what happened to Egyptian cotton. Why was it such a famous brand, and yet you would always hear stories about how the industry was declining and the textile industry was laying off workers by the thousands, so I chose to focus on three women who work in the garment industry at different levels. So one, Raham, she's a very educated upper-class woman who lives in Alexandria. And through a translator, I met her and learned that she was running a small factory of all women, young women, sewing garments for export. The second factory that I kind of stumbled on it because I was really curious about reporting outside of the big cities, and so I got to know this journalist who lived in Minya in Upper Egypt, and he said, oh, there's a lot of women who are working, I'll take you to some, and then in the way that often happens as a reporter, then he proceeded not to take me to any for like months and months, and I kept calling him and haranguing him and saying, please take me to where these places are where these women are working. And then finally he looked in the paper one time when I was visiting, and he said, oh, there's this ad for women workers at a factory, and I'll take you there. And so I went, and it was called the Delta Textile Factory. And everything about it was surprising. It was in the middle of the desert. I learned that it was owned by an Israeli-American investor from Tel Aviv who had set up this factory as kind of an idealistic project to bring friendship between the two sides, which now feels very far away. But so I kind of visited upstairs and looked down on the factory floor, and there was like all these assembly lines and hundreds of workers. And I was like, why has no one ever told me about this? So I started just getting to know the workers, and in the end, I focused on two. One is a woman named Rania, who was a supervisor of a production line when she started, and the other was a young woman named Doa, who was a security guard, but on the side she was studying for her college degree. So I found that they were generally representative in that these two women were not especially educated. They came from very ordinary, working class families. But both of them were quite ambitious and very expressive, and that's also why I chose them.
And last question before I turn to Lubna for her reactions, but aside from following their stories, you really tell this history and the current context of Egypt quite well. And I was wondering what were can you walk us through the common themes that you're touching upon, and how exactly do you glimpse into Egyptian society, its politics, its economy, through their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I found that there were some themes that went across all the stories of the women that I met. One was just generally the low status of women. In the factory context, I could see that they were incredibly ambitious and smart and capable, and they were learning how to create products that would then be exported and compete with companies around the world. So in that sense, very impressive. And yet, when they told me stories of how they were treated at home, whether if they were unmarried, it would be how their fathers tried to control them and tell them what to do. If they were married, it would be their husbands, often, really belittling the work that they did, and I would often meet the husbands and they would say, oh, I just let her work for fun, as if working in a factory for 10 hours a day is like a fun thing to do. And I found that the women themselves often downplayed their contributions to the family, and they would say, oh, I'm just working to make a little money to buy things for my kids, or I'm just working for some clothes and makeup for myself. But when, in cases where I would get to know what their economic situation was, I would learn that they were actually contributing a lot to their family. And yet it wasn't coming back to them in the form of more empowerment or more respect in their families and their communities. Another thing I found was just, in China, what I saw was that because the economy was growing so fast, young women had so much opportunity to work in factories, and if they didn't like this factory, they would jump to another. And this was so common, and you would meet people who had worked at 5 or 10 or 12 factories, and often they couldn't even remember which factory they'd been at because they'd been there for like 5 minutes and then left. And so that creates a lot of instability, but also a lot of opportunity. And these women in China would often earn enough money in a month that more than their families earned in an entire year. And so very quickly, they would sort of be supporting their families, but also getting a lot of respect. And in Egypt, because the economy just is much more stagnant and the manufacturing sector is much smaller and weaker, you just didn't see this dynamic where young women would work and overturn kind of the patriarchy very quickly. Instead, it felt like they were kind of stuck, even if personally they got a lot of benefits from their work. It didn't translate into any broader social change.
And then turning to Lubna now, how representative did you find this book of other subjects that we really take a look at, like the MENA paradox, like women's economic empowerment, from more of a policy perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for this wonderful work. The story that Leslie Chang has researched and shared with us is uplifting. You're looking at zones of empowerment. Unfortunately, academics are not very uplifting in their stories. So I'm going to tell a different story. And therefore, I've approached the book from at least two disciplinary prisms. One is the social political anthropologist in me, and the other one is the scholar in the politics of gender and development in the Middle East and North Africa. So they're not mutually exclusive, they're complementary. So from the anthropologist's perspective, it's exactly as Leslie Chang has told you, it's about understanding women's work in a different environment than China. But I am very sensitive as an anthropologist to the gaze of the anthropologist, to how we collect information, how we tell the stories, from which angle. But also, and I couldn't help, and this is no criticism, I was fascinated by, in the early part of the book, by Chang's search for China in Egypt. How similar. And then there were areas of frustration, confusion, and growth in trying to understand the not so familiar, the dissimilar. And that's where, for me, the story became really fascinating. How do we observe what is different and try to make sense of it? And in trying to make sense of it, I had to put on the different hat, that of the gender and development scholar. And that's when I say that the stories of Rania, Reham, and Doa are very personal, deeply personal. Individual trajectories, choices, constraints, and struggles from the family door to the factory floor. Yet at the same time, and without taking the personal from it, these are stories that are far beyond the personal. They are actually stories woven into deeper threads that take us to the history of female labor through many decades in Egypt, and their contribution to family economics, to local economics, to national, as well as to the global supply chain and circuits of production and consumption. It is all linked. It's their contribution at all of these levels. Therefore, the story becomes personal, but also political, economic, social, and legal, because it is deeply rooted and shaped, as well as informed by various struggles and histories. For example, as we've heard, is the history of industrialization and cotton production in Egypt. As well as the colonial investment in it. It's also the history of national pride and struggle for national sovereignty, but also national identity, as it is linked to culture, religion, and whatnot. It is the history of social and economic development and the different post-colonial regimes with their priorities. And of course, it is the struggle of it is the history of women's struggle with rights, justice, and gender power relations. So yes, these are very personal stories, and the story of female labor market participation in all of its scales, local, national, global, political, as well as personal, as we always keep repeating. So I propose my reading has led me to three sort of broad observations that I'd like to share with you. Because of the multi-layered, textured stories of these three women in factories, you are telling us indeed that the culturalist explanation of low female labor in Egypt is not enough. It isn't just about patriarchy, because if it were, then China would not have close to 60% of female labor. So it's not just about patriarchy, gender roles, and exclusions. Nor is it just the story of authoritarian regime, because otherwise China would tell us, well, authoritarianism excludes women. Therefore, it is a story of a confluence of forces that explain not only female labor and contribution to the market, but the major differences within that between the urban and the rural. That's a fascinating, captivating story that you are contributing with and giving voice to these stories. But you're also telling us that the way neoliberal globalization articulates with localities is very different. It does not produce the same results. Hence, we see 60% labor participation in China, close to 20% in the Middle East. So the first takeaway is, yes, we do need a very complex prism to understand the constraints as well as the potential of labor, female labor participation in the economy. Second, again, from the stories you're telling us in the broader context, economic reforms, which Egypt has been undergoing for many decades, obviously, economic reforms use words that we should use and understand very carefully. There are a lot of buzzwords, including inclusive growth, gender budgeting, equality, empowerment. And I'm not saying these are trivial, but they can be trivialized. And they are trivialized in a way that exacerbates rather than empower women's participation in the economy. So for me, really, the book is telling us that, and forgive me for the terms, there's a lot of economic stupidity in not tapping into the tremendous potential that you have found on the factory floors. Yeah. That it is a story that we have been telling and repeating in various forms along a whole spectrum of empowerment, from women and smart economics. Now I'm saying it's stupid economics, because we are just not really acting on what we mean by inclusive policies of development. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think your book does a lot of that, the overbearing state, the heavy investment in the military and whatnot. But the point here is female labor in Egypt is as much about economic reforms and national policies and priorities as it is about geopolitics. I think the factory you visited, its history is a history of peace.
Yeah.
Look where we are now.
Yeah.
So no comment on that one. But I'll move on to my third point, which is if the economy is not stagnant, no economy is. And women's participation in the labor market is also not stagnant. So there are various ways of looking at it. We can say it's only 20% of women in the labor force. But we can also look at it, if you look at the history of gender struggles, we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. And so current economies, unfortunately, or the economic growth actually is driven now by male-dominated sectors. And there is no surprise when that is the case. There is no surprise that women, because they are a social vulnerable group that function mostly and largely in the informal sector, the precarious sector, there is no question that they are going to be pushed further more towards that sector and towards more vulnerability. Therefore, the two sectors, as you know, in health and education that are among the most female-intensive sectors are, incidentally, the two sectors that are being severely underfunded. Mm-hmm. And why that is happening, another reminder of stupid economics, what are we doing with the potential? What opportunities, what alternatives are we creating? And so it seems like we know the story, we have the capacity to learn how to capitalize on women's creativity and potential and all of those wonderful things that women can contribute with, but we are stuck with the same script of prioritizing sectors over others. That's where I'll stop.
Okay, I will take your points one at a time since I thought you made some really interesting remarks, both on the confluence of factors that prevent women from entering the labor force in Egypt, all the way to quote-unquote economic stupidity. So to take your first point to both of you, I'll start with looking at if you could give me from both a grassroots perspective or an on-the-ground perspective, and from, again, Lubna, sort of this bird's-eye view perspective. You know, we've seen in our research on women trying to enter entrepreneurship various obstacles, from legal obstacles to cultural to as simple as access to transportation. Walk me through some of the specifics of how and what you were seeing as these quote-unquote preventers of female labor force participation in Egypt. And then I'll turn the same to Lubna, just to give me a little bit more specifics and, again, react to the book a little bit more on that front.
Yeah, I mean, there were certainly a lot of infrastructural issues in Egypt that prevented women from finding jobs, from, you know, terrible and unsafe and unreliable transportation in which women, even the ones who were working, would often, you know, wait for a bus for 2 hours, then it wouldn't come, then they'd have to pay extra money to take a taxi, and all these things were very exhausting and very, you know, not conducive to working, or if they were working, to continuing to work. And women often said they would stop working in the winter because the buses came less often, they didn't want to walk in the dark at night, you know, so that's just one example of a whole range of issues that make it hard for women to work. But when you look at the question of how might this change, I came to the conclusion that I don't know if this is the only solution, but I think the messaging really needs to start from the top. And then I found an interesting example in Egypt and in China. In Egypt, you know, during the 60s, when Nasser was building his socialist welfare state, one of the goals was to have women and men both educated in large numbers and employed in large numbers. And for many women, this was like their first opportunity in their families to work. And I looked at studies that showed that family opposition to women working actually changed quite quickly, you know, and the first group of women who were working in the 60s and early 70s, they often said, we have to lie to all our family members about what we're doing and pretend I'm going to school, so I had to carry books, and then they'd drop us off at the factory and we'd go run in and hope nobody would notice, But very quickly, their families realized, oh wow, working is good. Our daughters earn money, they'll meet more people, maybe they'll meet a more educated or hardworking or well-earning man to marry, so they could see work as opening up the horizons for their daughters and their families. So what you could see under Nasser was that this development started in which working women were seen as acceptable and even to be praised. And women started being able to pay more for their own marriages, which meant that they have more say in their own marriages. When you're starting to pay or earn and pay money, then you can say, well, I don't like this guy, I want a different guy, That all sort of came to a halt after the economic system of Nasser was sort of collapsed for various reasons. But it shows to me that there is a possibility for a strong visionary leader to really change how people see things. And this might be especially true in authoritarian countries in which people are used to, they often tune out the messages from the leader, but certainly the leaders have a lot of influence through the media and through their visibility and through the people around them to transmit messages. That isn't to say that I'm expecting the current leader to do this anytime soon, but it is sort of tantalizing to see that change can happen, and it doesn't mean that we're locked into this reality. And one last thing is, in China, you saw this as well. China, and the reason why I was searching for China in Egypt was not only because of my own experience, but because I did see a lot of general similarities between these two countries. They're both very old cultures with very long, proud traditions, and like you said, very patriarchal traditions as well. And what you saw in China was, after the communists came to power, they upended a lot of the patriarchal customs, from foot binding to this idea that women could only work at home. You've heard this famous phrase, women hold up half the sky. And, the communists did a lot of horrible things, but one thing they did was they really stamped out this old system in which women were seen as helpless, and the most elite women were seen as the most helpless. And of course, with China more recently, the economic situation has given women a lot of opportunity. So I feel like there's a lot of top-down things that could be done that would make huge changes, although I'm not expecting to see them anytime soon.
And then right before I turn to you, Lubna, I just want to probe this with you, is I feel like there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg scenario happening here, where we either look at top-down change as promoting norm change at sort of the bottom levels or the grassroots levels, or we look at the opposite, pressure from the bottom then going and changing laws. What are we seeing both in Egypt historically, and what are we seeing across the MENA region? How comparable is Egypt to these other cases? Because what you're saying reminds me a lot of what we're seeing in a lot of the Gulf states here, which is top-down change. Is this true in other parts of the region as well? How unique is Egypt here?
Oh, this question is to me.
To anyone.
Gosh, where do I start? All right, let me start on an optimistic note. Raghi Assad, economist, says something very simple and yet deeply profound and valid here. If the conditions are right, women will work in droves. The key word is if the conditions, right? Conditions are important. So a number of things to say here. I think what we've tried so far, and that is not working, is top-down policies. They haven't delivered. So we're repeating the same script, hoping that there will be a trickle-down effect of empowerment somehow. Magic doesn't happen in policy or economics. And therefore, I think that there is a lot of work to be done as we are attending to the macroeconomics, to think about the impact of the macro on people's lives, opportunities, and choices. And that requires a lot of humility in policy, to think about policy from the bottom up. It's something to try. Perhaps it'll work. But it's the intersection of both that really makes sense. Where I really agree with you is that we need leaders with a vision and the political will to make things happen, because people on the ground are working, and they are trying to.
Well, can I respond to that real quick? I mean, when I say top-down, it doesn't mean give a speech, that's the end of it. It means top-down, like encourage people to work, put policies in place that encourage women to work, hopefully build a manufacturing sector rather than just relying on, an economy based on rents to really draw women into the workforce. Because what I found on the ground in Egypt is there are, perhaps you could say they're quite small scale, but there are hundreds of small projects all over that are trying to bring women into the workforce, that are teaching them how to perhaps produce crafts for sale, or have a project, a cooperative in which women would invest together to raise livestock for sale. And what I could see on the ground was that a lot of these projects have a benefit for individual women, but they didn't create any larger change. And in the same, kind of a microcosm of these women I saw in the factories, they had economic benefit from working in the factory. Of course they did. They have a salary now when they didn't before, but that did not cause a larger change even with their own family. So certainly the top-down policies need to be informed by the needs and the situation of women themselves. But yeah, it's definitely just the bottom-up approach we can see doesn't do enough.
Right, and if I agreed. That's why I think both of us are talking about leadership with a vision, policies with a vision, policies that really mean what they say and what they promise. Because yes, indeed, change is possible, and we are seeing change. Egypt is a profoundly dynamic country, where and again, change is never linear, by the way, in post-colonial, societies, and particularly when these are related to women's works, rights situations. Everything is shaped by local, national, and geopolitics. I mean, it's huge in the case of Egypt, as it is in many other places in the Middle East. But what I also wanted to say is that we talk a lot about female labor as if it is like one package. But actually it's got a lot of, different pieces within it. It's labor, it's the quality of labor. And that's something we don't talk a lot about. 20%, is great. No, it's not so great when we know what the conditions, of the labor are. For example, and since we are talking about sort of comparison between Egypt and China, yes, there was a vision in China of really capitalizing on female labor. So we've seen an incredible growth in the rate of participation of women in the labor force. Unfortunately, again, when the conditions of work and the opportunities for women are not a priority, there are serious slippages. So over the last 2 decades, what we've seen in China is not an increase in female labor, but a decrease. As in, since the 90s, and since the state-owned enterprises, the SOWs have been, the state-owned, enterprises have been privatized, what we've seen is that the direction of the economy is sending women elsewhere. And the rate of participation has gone down from the all-high 70+ to the 60s. More importantly, the gender pay gap in the private sector has started showing troubling signals from what it was a difference of 15% in pay of men and women. Now it is upwards of 20 to 25%. So what I'm saying here is great to have a political vision, an inclusive economy and policy in how we want, to capitalize on labor of both men and women. But it's just as important to listen to, recognize what those policies are doing on the ground in urban and rural areas, because the impact can be vastly different. And empowerment is not, again, monolithic. I am not minimizing what women in factories can achieve by just stepping out of the home and becoming, as you portrayed so beautifully, either self-employed entrepreneurs as Riham, or the other, Rania and Dua, who are proving that they are capable of leadership. So there is a lot, that we can do with these lessons from the very micro to amplifying them so that we don't talk about women's entrepreneurship in the Middle East as if, oh, great, we have X number and X rate of women entrepreneurs. But the reality is those are entrepreneurships for survival, very micro, and we are hoping for massive change. That's not going to happen because there is a serious gap here.
On that note, I'd like to look a little bit more into, because I'm doing a lot of research right now on how to make economies work for women. So what does holistic change, all of government approaches look like? So in Egypt, we'll focus really specifically on this context here. Based on your field work in the region, how do we, make economies work for women? Meaning, how do we provide care work in a sense where they can then balance formal work with their care work? How do we overcome, gender budgeting, accessible transportation, all these barriers that are preventing women from entering the workforce? How do we make that work for women in this context, and what would that look like for a whole of government approach?
I feel like a lot of what has drawn women into the workforce is manufacturing, especially in poorer countries. That has been the avenue for economies to grow and develop and enter the higher stage of development, and that has also, by the way, been very positive for women. And when you look at first the nations such as Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China, and you also look at factory growth in Bangladesh and India and Morocco and places around the world, in many cases, those are quite traditional economies that have brought women into the workforce for the first time. And that is not to say, as Lubna points out very well, of course there are gaps in income between men and women. There also are gaps in income between men and women in America. So it doesn't mean we've gotten to this point where everything's great, but it's a starting point, and once you have that, then a lot of other things follow from that, which is, something I heard a lot in Egypt, which is men would say to me, the women, they're so irrational, they don't know how to do this work, and once they start working, it's like, oh, you know what, they know how to do this work and they're not irrational. So the proof comes through the work, and then that helps to dismantle some of these ideas that people still hold. I'll stop there. There's obviously many, many things that the government can do to make life better for women, such as, of course, daycare and a more sensitivity to work-life balance for both men and women. But if you wanted to look at very broad brush, that is something that has been shown to at least bring women into the workforce and start them on this path on a very large scale.
Any thoughts, Lubna, on all of government approaches?
I mean, she hit all the great points. I mean, we can take the easy way out, and I'm not dismissing it, for addressing things that can be addressed fairly easily. Transportation. It's it really changes the landscape here. Security and safety, right? You woke up many times at 4 or 5 in the morning to travel to Upper Egypt, and you notice, you really report with an incredible level of detail the encounters with anxiety and fear and insecurity, and that's important. And we also need to provide childcare, which Egypt has been trying to do with the IMF-driven 2016 type of reforms. These are two big things. Great, I cannot complain. As a mother, as a professional, I need both transportation in DC and childcare, right? But it's more than that. As, again, economists remind us, studying carefully the economy in Egypt, that it does not produce jobs. And so now we are talking about serious and structural transformations so that we can provide training. Egypt has provided fantastic levels of education. The gap has been closed. But I think the fundamental question has not been asked, education for what? Because our educated young people have given up on looking for jobs. And the jobs that are there, those are not choice, those are necessity. It's because of the levels of poverty and because I fear to say women would do anything to bring food on the table at the end of the day. And so that is great, but again, I am just seeing here hopes postponed of what we can do with female education and labor, hence, the paradox that we are talking about. I'm also seeing a lot of waste of energy, potential, and creativity. So we need to work on all fronts. We need to work on the micro, on the macro, and we need to attend to the short-term fixes, but really think about restructuring the economy so that incentivizes both men and women to be very productive.
Thank you. Wonderful. And now we'll pivot to questions from both the in-person and online audience. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and we'll provide you with a microphone. If there are no questions in person, please, Marissa.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Leslie and Lubna. This is a fascinating discussion and touches on a lot of the work that we've been doing here on female labor participation as well as women in entrepreneurship. One thing that, I kept thinking about, where we see, the 20% or in, my home country of Jordan, even lower, 14% female labor participation. The vast majority of women are actually employed in the public sector, in the government. And I've had multiple conversations with women at various levels of government about why, government is the way to go. And of course, going back to your point, Lubna, this is also a structural issue. This is a challenge that Jordan and Egypt in particular is facing, the bloating of the public sector. But of course, they go back and they tick off the same boxes that the private sector is not able to address. Childcare, in certain cases, transportation, things are easier to get to than some of the new, developments where either startups are being nurtured or factories are being built. And this has been going on for a very long time. We've been talking about these reforms for over 25 years. And we see progress, and it's very important to highlight it. And I love that you are telling the story, Leslie, of these women to sort of, better understand the contextual environment. But my question is, how do we, break that cycle? Because it seems that the, reforms are taking place, but the progress is slow, a little bit slower than what we hope for, because it's the education gap has been largely closed. It's not translating into the labor market. We know these barriers, but these are just barriers. There's more to the story. And I wonder, how do we have these conversations? Do we need women economists to inject some of these ideas at the policymaking level? Because that's another feature, that we don't have women leaders. If we're talking about leadership with vision, there aren't women leaders at the helm to set that tone. So where do we make that intervention? Like, what is it that what is the binding constraint that has to be sort of broken in order to see more significant progress?
I think, having lived in China and then in Egypt, that the leaders don't really understand economics. Can we say that? And they have been getting these policy papers, as you said, for 20, 30 years about how we need to build a manufacturing sector and how we need to, develop our education system. And I'm sure in some sense they agree with it, but they don't know how to do it. And it probably seems pretty daunting, but I just think, PowerPoint and case studies, let's look at where was Korea in 1950 1960, and where was it in 1980? And, you know, where was China in 1980, and where was China in 2000? And, you know, as I point out in my book, when I started going to China in the 90s, it was still seen as sort of an economic basket case, and you would go into restaurants and people would say, oh, our food is terrible and we don't have much of it, you know, like the service was terrible, nobody wanted to help you. And, you know, that sounds like a joke now. Everyone's like really hardworking and, not everyone, like people are generally very hardworking, very motivated because they can see that if I work hard, I can have benefits. So I think it's important to be optimistic in the sense that change can happen, but it takes a lot of work and it also takes a lot of pain. Something else I see about the Egyptian government is they seem afraid of making these big policy changes because they're worried about a lot of people getting hurt and then it'll come back on them in the form of protest. And, you know, this also happened in China in the 90s when the state-owned enterprises were being dismantled. There were millions of people who were out of work, and there were tons of protests, especially in the old industrial heartland in the north and the northeast. And the government got through that, and the way they got through that was by encouraging and allowing private enterprise that gradually picked up the slack. And so people stopped dreaming for that state-owned dream. I mean, the state-owned dream is great. You work very little, you get a solid salary, you get the hospital and the medical care and the school, and you have a community. It's not hard, it's very stable. And if you take that away from people, it's really hard. Who doesn't want that? You know, we all want that, right? But if you take that away and you show them, well, this is the different thing you have instead, you're probably gonna work harder, it's gonna be more stressful, but you're gonna make more money. At the end of the day, you're gonna be happier. And in China now, you don't meet anyone who says, I wish we could go back to 1980. But in Egypt, you meet tons of people who say, I wish we'd go back to the 60s. That was the golden time, you know. And the reason is because they haven't quite killed this old thing that doesn't work, and they haven't allowed the new thing that actually does work. So they're kind of stuck in between.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, change comes with a price, with a huge price. Rewards, obviously, but there is fear all around. I mean, I grew up hearing Egyptian people on television soap operas making jokes about IMF policy, structural adjustment and whatnot, you know, fasten your seatbelt. Right? شدوا الحزام, شدوا الحزام, you know, like be frugal, do this, do that. The Egyptian people are exhausted, and that is reflected in the number of, in the scales of poverty. Because we, again, another buzzword is resilience. We're counting on the poor to continue to be resilient. And it's exhausting. But the change that we are talking about has no shortcuts. Absolutely no simple paths. There has to be decisions. Now, the fear of seeing mobilization on the ground, the likes of, you know, Arab Uprisings and all of that, that's always a possibility. The question is, what are we doing with it? I mean, how loud can a population scream dignity to understand that we can do and we need to do policy with dignity? So yes, it is huge. Now, to your point, which is very important, that's why women's activism works on all fronts. Yes, we do need women economists, not tokens. We need substantive number of voices sitting at the table and explaining away stupid economics. And we do need women represented in various political spaces, and we need strong institutions. I mean, at all levels. We cannot have the kind of reforms. We've had reforms, and you're absolutely right. These are more promises on the books than they are really translation in people's lives. So we really need meaningful investment in the project of uplifting people from poverty and building institutions, the private sector being one, so that it can absorb our educated and our labor force, male and female. I think the country needs all sorts of creativity and labor.
Thank you. We have one Any questions in the room? If not, I'll take, Christina. Yes, if you could introduce yourself when you get the mic and then ask your question.
Do I need to stand or is this okay? Okay. Hi, I'm Christina. I'm the Research Associate in Middle East Studies from the Council on Foreign Relations. This is actually pertaining to, I guess, a specific case study. So I'm Jordanian for background, and like a lot of things that I noticed in my own friends is that while I was at the University of Jordan, an overwhelming majority are women, and once these women graduate, they go into the workforce. You know, many of them having taken their tawjihi exam, the entrance exam to go to college, which secures you if you go to college into a public sector position. But what happens at that point is that it's this cycle of where once they're employed, they aren't given the opportunity to move up if you were to look at the conventional ladder in employment, and then they become reliant on their husbands who do have that opportunity. And then when you add a layer of it on intersectionality, these women who stay at Yarmouk University or the University of Jordan versus their wealthier counterparts who go to the UK or the US, once they come back, they enter the private sector through family connections of wasta. So what would be the solution to that if you look at the micro level? Like, does it have to start with the father, who the father, instead of choosing to send his son out to the UK or the US instead of his daughter? Or would it be looking at local institutions like the baladiyat? What can they do to incentivize local families? Or what can you do at the state level? Because it's very performative in Jordan. I mean, you see things happening at the top-down level, but it's relatively performative. So, you know, how would you approach it in that way? Because I think that in most cases, as we see, even in the US, it is definitely an issue of intersectionality.
Would anyone like to take this? Lubna?
Thank you. Thank you for joining us in the same story. I don't know why, but that's how the stream of consciousness works for me. As you were talking, I was thinking about two important changes and factors that we haven't brought to the fore. And one is the incredibly skyrocketing rate of divorces in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East. So over 2 decades in Egypt alone, it grew by almost 80%. Why am I saying this? Because it's related now to an increase in female-headed households, divorcees and widows. 1/5 of the households in Egypt are run by women. Some are educated, many are not. And the needs are huge within, indeed, a patriarchal environment. So it isn't just about the security of public sector. It's about attending to the shifts that are happening at the social level as well, in terms of family units, in terms of who is earning. And I keep saying, this is no longer male is the provider, let's go to marriage. Everybody's obsessed about marriage, which is true. But then again, we don't talk enough about divorce and the economic consequences of divorce, and as it relates to a female labor. So it is a complicated story, this business of female labor and contribution to the market. And it's changing with more opportunities as well as newer challenges.
Can I also?
Please.
So part of the challenge is the education system itself and how the Tawjihi system in Jordan basically places students in different sectors based on how well they perform, right? So those who are at the bottom of the ladder in their final exam they go to the social sciences. Very disturbing. Very disturbing that some of these actually go to study theology and Sharia. Why are we doing this? So that system has to be restructured. And so this is a system that was set up to produce high-quality doctors, engineers, and lawyers, and everybody else was sort of in between, right? So that is more sort of an overarching, challenge, like this, the structure of the system itself that links the educational system to the labor market has to be reformed. And then the other point about the disparity. I mean, of course, there's an income gap, and you see these variances. Those with means have opportunities, but you touched upon a very important point, which is the network. And don't underestimate the networks at various levels of society. But going back to Lubna's point, with family pressures, I haven't looked into the reasons why these divorce rates are really high, but there is a sense of empowerment when women are becoming part of the breadwinning formula. But there's a sense of loss of power on the male front. And so when we talk about female labor participation, we need to engage all members of the family unit and of the local community. So it, again, going back to what Leslie was saying and Lubna was saying earlier, it really has to be both for the top level where policy is being prescribed and written, but also efforts at the grassroots level that includes so many stakeholders, from the local government to other people who have influence. I mean, like religious leaders. I've listened to some popular shows in Jordan on the radio out of curiosity. It was an anthropological experiment where women call in to ask if this is okay, if it's okay to take a job, for example, at a bank that's not an Islamic bank, right? So their terms of reference in that case was the sheikh, right? So all of these stakeholders at that level have to be engaged in the conversation, and it takes time. It's going back to your point. It doesn't happen overnight, Lubna, right?
Alrighty, thank you all. We're just approaching time. If there are any last words, Leslie, if you would like to. One more question. This will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up.
You haven't said much yet about the emerging careers for women, let alone the men, say in Egypt or any country. But if you follow the news, we're going to lay off 260,000 people in tech, they think, by the end of the year here. That's a rather substantial sum. They don't give any reasons, but, industries grow and retreat. There's always change. And as far as careers go, the women are, getting into these new positions, climate change, emergency management, police, rescue, you name it. They're very inventive and a great help to a nation, any nation. So the same would apply to Egypt or anywhere, especially if the government permits them to work and allows them to do things that they might not normally do.
Yeah, I think for sure there's emerging opportunities in sectors that haven't existed before in Egypt as in anywhere else. I think there's sometimes a danger, and I saw this in Egypt, where people jump onto the new thing and they're like, yeah, we're going to build, let's not do this textile garment thing, let's build on the call centers. And then it's like, let's not do the call centers, let's do the whatever technology. And yeah, I mean, that's fine, but at the end of the day, the same requirements apply to whatever industry you choose to embrace and develop. You still need, good training, you still need good education, you still need the right messages, you still need a functioning economic system in which people can start their own businesses, whether it's in these emergent technologies or in whether it's a shop or a clothing factory. I think the same rules still apply. So I think sometimes, especially in Egypt, we see this a lot, where something's not working, let's just leave it and set up something else brand new. And it's like, well, there are a lot of people who are still in that old thing, and there are a lot of problems in how you implemented that, and you still haven't solved it. So we can do both. We can set up the new thing, but also figure out how we made mistakes to kind of figure out what the old thing is, because at the end of the day, these sort of traditional industries will still be a large part of the economy for many years to come.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question, and we are a little bit over time, so I would just like to wrap up by thanking Leslie for writing such a rich book. You've told some really fantastic stories and really contextualized them within the larger context. I'd like to thank Lubna again for serving as today's discussant, and Marissa as well. And I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.